Hi, in this lecture, I will talk about some cognitive illusions or cognitive pitfalls, the identification of which helps us become better reasoners. So as a review, last lecture I talked about two different systems, System 1 and System 2. The three ways in which these systems differ can be summarized in terms of the three following things. First, control. Second, transparency. And third, effort. Okay, so for control, the idea is that with System 1 things, we don't really have conscious or direct control over what happens. Okay, when we see an angry face, we immediately sense that it's angry, or when we see something that is gross to us, we immediately feel disgust, and we can't really control our reactions. Okay, whereas with System 2 things, we do have control. The other one is transparency, so the way in which System 1 works isn't obvious to us. Okay, so it's not obvious to us how it is that our visual system constructs the world around us on the basis of the images on our retina. It's not obvious to us why, for instance, we get goosebumps. It requires some thought to realize why our System 1 is doing that. Okay, whereas System 2, the way it works is transparent to our consciousness. And the third thing is effort. So System 1 takes very little conscious effort. That these things just these reactions just happen very quickly. Whereas certain problems, for instance, solving a difficult math problem, requires a lot of effort. So System 2 requires effort. So again, the three differences are in terms of control, transparency, and effort. Today, I'm going to talk about certain cognitive illusions that arise from the operation of System 1. These illusions or pitfalls are the availability heuristic, belief perseverance, confirmation bias, and evidence primacy effect. Okay, so these are four different ways in which we can be led astray or reason badly by not recognizing that we're letting our kind of immediate System 1 take over. Okay, and again, as I talked about in the last video, the reason why these illusions happen is because the simple System 1 is taking certain shortcuts. Okay, and these simple ways that System 1 provides us for reasoning can be too simplistic or stubborn, okay, and also can have roots in our kind of deeper motivations. So we have to root out these problems, and it's quite difficult. So we want to avoid taking too many shortcuts or being too stubborn or letting our motivations, our kind of hidden or secret motivations affect how we reason. Okay, so here are a couple examples of these cognitive illusions in action. So I want you to consider the following question. So I tell you a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, for many people, the answer that quickly jumps to mind is that the bat costs $1, okay, and the ball costs 10 cents, and that's so in total they cost $1.10. However, that answer is not correct because if the bat costs $1 and the ball costs 10 cents, the bat actually only costs 90 cents more than the ball. So here we have a kind of very quick gut reaction, a very quick answer to this question that's provided to us. But we shouldn't trust that quick answer because it's not correct. Now I'll leave it as an exercise for you reflect and figure out what exactly the right answer is to how much the bat and the ball cost. Okay, but it is different than what for many people is the immediate answer, that the bat costs $1 and the ball costs 10 cents. Here's another test, and I won't go into detail. I'll leave this for you to think about. So if you want, you can pause the video and think about what your initial reaction is, and then spend a bit more time to discover what the real answer is. So the question is that in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. So if it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the whole lake, how many days does it take for the patch to cover half the lake? Okay, so you can reflect on what might be the intuitive answer, and then once you have your intuitive answer, think about whether that's correct or not. Okay, so in these tests, we have a tendency to jump to certain conclusions for the answers. However, those conclusions that we jump to are not actually correct. So we have to avoid that tendency and realize that our mind naturally takes certain shortcuts, but in many cases, those shortcuts lead us astray. So here's another question. I ask you, which company is larger? Which company has more revenues, Toyota or Mazda? Okay, so which one is bigger, Toyota or Mazda? Or also, which of the two has larger revenues, Coca-Cola or Cargill Foods? Okay, so the right answer to the first question is Toyota. However, the natural answer to the second question is Coca-Cola, at least for me. That was what I naturally thought was the bigger. Coca-Cola was bigger than Cargill. However, that answer is incorrect. Coca-Cola is an enormous company and owns all of these brands. Okay, so it's very large in terms of the number of different brands it owns. However, in terms of revenues, Cargill Foods is much bigger. Okay, so just to give approximately, Coca-Cola has about 35 billion, whereas Cargill has over 100 billion. Here's another question. Suppose I ask you the following. Is a word more likely to start with the letter K or have K as a third letter? Okay, so is it more likely for a word to start with the letter K or have K as the third letter? So I will just take a moment to think about the answer to that question. Now, the grand majority of people who have been asked this said that a word is more likely to start with the letter K. And on average, when people were asked how much more likely, people said that it's twice as likely for a letter to start with, for a word to start with the letter K. Okay. And it seems like the reason why it kind of seems to you that it's more likely for a word to start with the letter K is that it's easier to think of words that start with K. Okay, so if you just think, okay, I want to think of a word that starts with K, it's much easier to think of examples of that. For instance, kite, keep, kayak. Okay, and it's much harder to immediately think of words that have K as a third letter. But here are a few. Take, ankle, acknowledge, makeshift, ink. So really, it's not clear what the right answer to this question is. There might be many more words with K as a third letter. However, because when you're asked this question, many more words that start with K jump to mind, and because examples of the first one, i.e. words that start with K are more easily come to mind or more available, people think that it's actually more likely for a word to start with K. But that's just because it's easier or more available easier to think of words that start with K than it is that have K as a third letter. Okay, so in many cases, how easily something comes to mind affects how likely we think it is. And this is a heuristic, which is called the availability heuristic, judging something's frequency or probability by asking how easily we can think of examples. And this is called a heuristic because in many cases it's helpful or good, but in many cases it leads us astray because in many cases how easily we can think of examples doesn't actually truly tell us something's actual frequency. Okay, so a heuristic is a cognitive shortcut that bypasses more effortful reasoning. So using a heuristic is kind of like using system one. Okay, it's a very quick way of getting an answer. But the reason why this is merely a shortcut is because there's many cases in which it goes wrong. So there might be many reasons why something is available to memory that are completely irrelevant to the thing's frequency. So it might be, so the intensity of emotion or emotional attachment to something might make it more available to memory. So you more easily remember, say, intense arguments that you had than just normal conversations. Okay? Or the way the question is framed might skew what comes to memory, what is available to memory, or the way things are ordered, or media biases. Okay, so there's many cases in which the availability to memory is actually influenced by irrelevant factors. So as an example of the final one, consider the following question: which animal kills the greatest number of people? And I think, at least for myself and for many people, the immediate answer would be that it's a shark or maybe a bear. But if we look at the actual statistics, the answer is mosquitoes, and then humans after that. Okay, so this is actually an example of more than just media biases in the sense that, you know, the most horrific, say, shark killings are the ones that are reported, but also it's an example of intensity of emotion, maybe, right? Because someone being killed by a shark is a much more intense thing to think about. Okay. So that is the availability heuristic and some examples of it. And the availability heuristic stems from the system one tendency to use shortcuts. Okay. But in addition to using shortcuts, there's also the tendency to be stubborn, which is to hold on to beliefs without good reason. Okay, and stubbornness leads to the evidence primacy effect, which is the tendency to give early information more evidential weight than late information. So why does this arise from stubbornness? Well, we typically gain information over time. Okay, and what happens is that we develop an opinion early on the basis of the first bit of evidence. And then any new evidence we get, we interpret in the light of that early opinion. Okay, and often it's maybe not even evident to us that we've already formed an opinion, but yet we still kind of made up our minds. And any new evidence makes it harder to change that initial impression. Okay, so here is a relevant study which showed that humans are likely to do this. Okay, so the subjects were asked to assess a defendant's guilt based on whether the evidence based on evidence they were given. Okay, however, the two groups of subjects were given the same evidence but in different order. So one group was first given the evidence of the person helping an old lady across the street. And then afterwards was told that this man, the defendant, was yelling at his kids. Okay. And the other group, however, was shown first the man yelling at his kids, and then afterwards him helping the old lady. Okay. And as it turns out, people's opinion about the person's guilt was influenced by what order the evidence was presented. So if the good evidence of the person helping the lady across the street was presented first, then the probability of guilt was less than 50, 45%. But if the evidence seen first was that the defendant doing something bad, yelling at his kids, it was 3/4 of a probability of guilt that the subjects assigned. Okay, so what this shows is that it's the exact same evidence, but the order of the evidence mattered. But of course, the order really shouldn't matter. Yet, what happens is that with the evidence primacy effect is that the first thing that we're shown kind of gives us a first impression, and it's then harder to shake that first impression. Okay, and a related thing in the third cognitive pitfall is that of belief perseverance, and that is a tendency to continue holding a belief even if its original support has been discredited, and in the face of contrary evidence. Okay, so this is another cognitive pitfall that arises from stubbornness. Okay, so you form a belief on the basis of certain original evidence that you have, and then you continue to hold the belief even if that support is discredited or conclusive contrary evidence is shown. Okay, so here is a study showing how people can be susceptible to belief perseverance. Okay, so in the study, the subjects were given a bunch of suicide notes, and they were told that they had to identify for each of them whether it was real or fake. And after the subject made a decision for each of these notes, they were given feedback about whether they were right or not. Okay, so the subject would say this one's real, and they would then get feedback about whether it was real or not. Okay. However, the feedback given was completely random. Okay, so it was completely random whether the subject was told that they were correct about identifying the real and fake notes. And furthermore, the subjects were told that all the feedback was bogus after they kind of went through the study of identifying real or fake notes and then being told whether they were correct or not. They were told that their feedback was completely just a random thing. But nonetheless, even after they were told that the feedback they got was completely arbitrary, they still rated themselves as better at determining the realness of a suicide note based on the feedback which they got. Okay, so the idea here is that on the basis of this feedback about one's accuracy, one forms a belief that one is good at telling whether a note is real or not. And then even after you're told that feedback you got, the basis of you thinking you're a good identifier was bogus, you still hold on to the belief that you're pretty good. Okay, so this is a case where a belief perseveres even after its original support is discredited. And in the study, they found that people, in fact, are susceptible to this. Okay, now finally, there's something called confirmation bias, which is a tendency to notice or focus on potential evidence for our pre-existing views and to neglect or discount contrary evidence. Okay, so this is related to stubbornness, but it's also related to a final thing of how motivations can influence our reasoning. Okay, so here's an example of confirmation bias. So Diego has the idea that he has ESP. So ESP is the ability to read minds. Okay, so this guy has, for some reason, started to believe that he has this special ability. Okay. So he then notices that he'll be thinking about someone and then he'll see them or they'll text or phone him very quickly. And he takes this as evidence. He says, holy cow, this can't just be a coincidence. You know, whenever I think of someone, I see them. And then, so for example, he thinks of his friend and then they end up calling him and he says, oh, it just happened again. This is evidence that I can kind of read minds or be telepathic. Okay. However, the problem with this is that just because this happens one time, i.e., it happens one time that he thinks of someone and they call him, he's not taking into account all the cases in which he thinks of someone and they don't call him. Okay, so confirmation bias here involves focusing only on the cases that confirm your pre-existing belief. Okay, and it's very easy to only consider cases that do confirm it, and not realize that there's many cases which disconfirm your belief. Okay, so confirmation bias itself is about how you acquire and assess evidence. Okay, it's about, in particular, about only focusing on certain pieces of evidence, i.e., ones that confirm the things that you already believe. So, in of itself, confirmation bias is not about your motivations. It's about how you acquire and assess evidence. So confirmation bias can be either motivated or unmotivated, but there's many cases in which it is motivated. Okay, so you might have a pre-existing belief that you really, really want to be true. You have a certain attachment to it. So imagine you're Diego, or you're like Diego, and you think it would be really, really cool if you had the special ESP abilities. Okay, you really want it to be true that you are special and have superpowers. And if you have this great attachment to that belief, then you can be motivated to only focus on cases in which it is confirmed, i.e., the cases when you do think of someone and they call you, and to ignore the cases in which someone comes to mind, but then nothing happens. Okay, and this is a case in which confirmation bias is motivated, is motivated by your attachment to your beliefs. Okay, and what's important to notice about motivated reasoning is that our reasoning can be so motivated in a bad way, but it is not obvious to us. Motivated reasoning is rarely deliberate and almost always operates below the level of conscious awareness. So when you talk about motivated reasoning, we don't mean deliberate reasoning. Okay, so don't think of motive here like the motive for a crime. So the motive for a crime is usually conscious and deliberate. Okay, so someone, for instance, is really angry at someone else and maybe chooses to track them down and do something horrible. In that case, the motive is a very conscious and deliberate thing. Okay, but that's not the kind of motives typically when we think about motivated reasoning. Okay, often we are motivated to ignore certain evidence in a way that's not obvious to us. Okay. So here is a kind of illustration of that. So this is a comic and it's supposed to be funny. And this is I guess, a professor at a podium. And he's talking about some claim P that he wants to believe. So he says, if this claim P is false, I will be sad. I do not wish to be sad, therefore P is true. Okay, so this is obviously a very bad argument, and it's also a very motivated piece of reasoning. Okay, so this person is motivated to believe P because they would be sad if it weren't true. But when the idea is that when we make this motivated reasoning explicit, like this professor is doing here, it seems silly and obviously wrong. And hopefully everyone can acknowledge that motivated reasoning is bad and should be avoided. However, it is very, very rarely that our motivated reasoning is made explicit like this. Okay, so it's very difficult actually to determine when you're actually engaging in motivated reasoning. Another reason why it can be difficult to tell that you're engaging in motivated reasoning is that most people think of themselves as very, very good reasoners. Okay, and just most people think of themselves as just very good at certain things. So there's been certain studies that show that most people think that they are better than most people in all of the following respects: physical attractiveness, intelligence, athletic ability, leadership, social competence, sincerity, being considerate, being less rude, being less superficial. Okay, so the majority of people think that they are better than other people in all these ways, including being objective or fair or unbiased. Okay, so we all like to think of ourselves as very good reasoners. Okay, but we can't, obviously, we all can't be better than most people. And in many cases, even the best of us fall victim to these cognitive pitfalls that I've been talking about in this lecture and which we'll be talking about throughout the course. Okay, and it's very important that we try to recognize the fact that we engage in these things in order to try to become better at reasoning. Okay, so to further elaborate this, 80% of Americans consider themselves more ethical or moral than their peers. 92% of people are satisfied with their ethical character, and you might wonder whether, in fact, 92% of people should be satisfied with their ethical character. It just seems that many of these people are probably wrong. And the large majority of people consider themselves more intelligent, more fair-minded, and less prejudiced. Okay, so finally, I'll conclude this lecture with some other ways in which we engage in motivated confirmation bias. So the first is selective noticing. So that is selective noticing is when observations that support a hypothesis bring that hypothesis to mind, causing us to notice that they support the hypothesis. Okay, so this is exactly what happened with Diego, who believed that he has psychic powers. Okay, in a case in which he thinks of someone and then they call him, for instance, that occurrence brings the hypothesis that he is psychic to his mind, and he realizes, oh, here's a confirming instance. But the cases in which someone crosses his mind and then nothing happens, he thinks nothing of it. So that's why he's more likely to focus on the cases in which he does think of someone and then they call. Okay. The second one is restricted search. And restricted search is failing to seek out the full range of alternative views or the full range of potential evidence for the views. Okay. And in many cases, this could be motivated, but it's rarely deliberate. And we'll discuss this in more detail in the next lecture on Thursday. Now, the final one is biased evaluation. And a biased evaluation involves evaluating the strength of potential evidence in a way that's influenced by our initial view. And this will also be discussed in chapter 2 next